Welcome to Responsible AI in Action. I am your host, Charles Dimov, CMO of Comma AI, the leader in responsible AI technology. Today, I have Dr. Kem-Laurin Lubin with me discussing human agency in the age of AI. We're also going to discuss a little bit about the culturally attuned system design and what it means to build responsible AI technologies that do no harm. Very important topic in that regard. Dr. Kem-Laurin is a researcher, designer, and professor at the University of Waterloo. Her work sits at the intersection of design research, AI, and computational rhetoric. Her recent book, Design Heuristics for Emerging Technologies, explores responsible AI and how the systems we build bring in values, shape judgment, and affect the lives of real people. Welcome, Kem.
Thank you for having me, Charles.
Absolutely. It is a delight to have you with us. So, Cam, let me jump right in. We often think about responsible AI technologies and practices during the deployment stage. A lot of organizations are like that. But in truth, organizations really need to and should be thinking about responsible practices far earlier than that in their sessions. Now, in fact, it really is a little bit too late, in my opinion, to be thinking about this during the deployment of a system. So, Cam, why is the procurement stage, or even earlier than procurement, really the critical time for working out what is a responsible AI system, and what are the processes involved, and what should all of this look like for an organization?
Yes, it's a big question and lots to unpack there. So,
Mhm.
when I answer these questions, I also like to provide my framing and my stance. Where am I coming from, and what gives me the credibility to talk about this? So, I've worked in the tech industry for over 20 years before returning to complete this doctoral degree on computational rhetoric and artificial intelligence. And one of the things I'm very well aware of from practice is that many companies, whether it's a small mom and pop shop that is using a tool, often purchases the tool or they're doing a subscription service of a tool. And I want to contextualize this response a little bit. So imagine you're a medical facility where you have therapists to work there, and you're deciding, well, for efficiency purposes, you'd like to procure a tool to help your therapist with, whether it is scribing or whatever other part of the function that takes up lots of time. So that phase
Mhm.
you can call deployment to some extent, where they've
Mhm.
actually purchased and procured the tool, and they're saying, well, now everybody needs to use this tool. That's another conversation we need to have about, mandating people use these tools. So the point I want to make here is that this is already too late. This is
Mhm.
already too late when you've decided that you've procured a tool without performing what I call a values audit on the tool. The tool has
Definitely.
actually gone through a foundational state of being built where you have, at this point, baked in value systems, right? And I'll give the
Mhm.
example of specifically predictive policing tools, where it
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
leveraging the analog data of generations of oppression and devaluation of marginalized communities, whether it's Black communities, Indigenous communities.
Yes.
And now, say,
Yes.
for example, you're an enforcement agency, say in Toronto, and this has happened, where you're
Mhm.
purchasing this tool and now you're deploying it on masses of people, a citizen population. And so you have this built-in already skewing and bias towards these communities. And now this is operating at scale through this deployment phase. So what I caution, and this is just not just about predictive policing or therapy, but it really goes beyond that. And so
Mhm.
procurement for me is very much too late. It is in the building and figuring out whose values are baked in. And oftentimes, Charles, it is the values of a white Eurocentric perspective, right? So this
Yeah.
is why I
Yeah.
think about this day in and day out. It's a thought that never leaves my mind. And to wrap up this, I think I want to, and I had this conversation with your CEO in terms of when we think about these tools, often baked in are also very highly masculinized perspectives and value systems. There is, in fact, a lack of feminine virtues. And this is just one
Mhm.
layer when we think of value systems, right? Whether they're indigenous values, Ubuntu values. It is really just, I feel like when we talk about this, we're just in the lobby of a very big conversation in terms of that state from baking in values to deployment in varying contexts. So, yeah, so at this point, it is already too late. And so, what I would advise companies who are procuring tools that they deem to be something that will help with efficiency, productivity, there needs to be at the onset some sort of values audit to understand whose values we're inviting to our workspaces where we're working with these tools. So, yeah,
Mhm.
I hope that answers the
Yeah,
question.
you've touched on some really interesting and fascinating things. I mean, bringing in more the feminine side of things, and not kind of the Silicon Valley bro mentality and such, which I think is probably what you're alluding to there. So that's good. Let me jump into the next question here now. So some of your research explores human agency and when people interact with AI systems, what is actually being transacted between humans and an AI system when decisions or recommendations are being made?
Yes, good question. So again, I really like to operate from a perspective, like where do I stand on this? So I've worked for over 20 years, this sort of ages me, as a human-centered design researcher, human factors researcher. And so a big part of my life was spent managing people who practice a function called user interface design. And central to that practice was the artifact of the user interface, where I, as a user, and again, that's a metaphor we need to unpack in another conversation, Charles. But no, but in that context, imagine a user-computer interaction. Now, what has become quite novel in the last 5 years is the whole idea of this interaction now being powered by artificial intelligence. And I tell my designers when I was in that general space is that we owe a responsibility as sentinels of that space, the user interface, we're reporting and giving so much of our information into a system, right? As part of that interaction, we're giving and we ask, what is it taking away from us, right? The premium services and all of these things. And so what is being actually taken away from us? A number of things, but most importantly, it's taking away our agency. It's taking away specializations, how we do things. It's taking away decision-making processes, right? And so we really need to understand in that space, when we say we're interacting with the system, it is a very complex interaction that is one by one in one direction, so to speak. While it's giving us, decisions based on things that we're interacting with it about, there is a big extraction happening in that interaction. And what it is taking away from us is fundamentally our human agency. And I think we're all slowly coming to that realization that this is what we're
Mhm.
losing, over time. Hmm.
Yeah, that is a scary idea that you're bringing up there. The idea that human agency is being eroded or taken away. Now, I do hope for a more optimistic view as well, that perhaps there's an element that we are giving up, but at the same time that we're getting
Yeah.
something else in return. But still, regardless, it's really important that you kind of bring that up to say, hey, we should be, okay, it's important to say, yes, here's what we're getting out of it, but also to understand all the elements of saying, here's what we're giving up. Is there a balance between these two? Because a lot of times we get really excited about the technology and we get right into it and we say, wow, look at the future. Is it going to be great? The future is bright. And yet there are times where you don't realize that, oh, but to get there, we lost this other thing, which
Yes.
was really important to us. So that is, thank you for
Yes.
bringing that up because that is an important element. Now,
Yes.
my next question is actually going to test
If
my
I can just
capabilities of,
chime in, if I
yeah,
can just add too.
yes,
So
yes, please.
yes, I am not a tech determinist to say that we have to ascribe to that. And I'm also
Mhm.
not one to say that artificial intelligence is good or bad. It is what we do with it. And it is
Mhm.
what we do with it with a degree of caution in understanding that in that interaction, there is something being lost, there's something being gained as well, too, because there are frictions around productivity that sometimes I use AI tools to get me there faster.
Sure.
But
Yes.
we should be aware of in terms of the long term, the both short and long term impact of that prolonged use of technology and what it is doing to us in that cycle of use as well.
Good points.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, we've spoken about the concept of ethiopoiesis.
So
Hopefully I
poia,
got
yes.
that one right.
Everybody has difficulty with that word.
That is a difficult, that's a challenging word to say. Now, this is how systems characterize people and then respond based on those characterizations. So help
Yes.
me and maybe the audience better understand this concept, first of all. And then the second part is I'd like you to also help me, can you give us an example? And why is this especially dangerous when AI systems are operating at scale? So
Mhm.
help us unpack this.
Yeah, so anthropoia, that word, people often ask, why that word? So I am
Yes.
a rhetoric scholar. And so when you come from a specific faculty or a specific training, you say things a certain way. So somebody may
Mhm.
call this characterization, someone may call this something
Mhm.
else. But within my
Mhm.
practice of computational rhetoric, it is called anthropoia. If we look at the grandparent of what that term was. And in
Right.
ancient Greece, what it was basically was the origin of the legal justice system when back in Athens, you had an opportunity as a citizen to defend yourself in the public square. And so, if you
Mhm.
were not a learned person, you would go to somebody who could write and characterize the script as if it was you, right? So, writing in your voice. And so
Yes.
that became the origin of my use of that term. So,
Ah,
I
fabulous.
was, yes, so it is basically how do I write in your voice, Charles? How do I characterize you and project you? So fast forward now, the central aspect of my research looks at this space called algorithmic anthropoia. The fact that
Mhm.
algorithms are now characterizing us through
Mhm.
the artifact, the portal of the graphical user interface. It is known so much about us. It's collecting data, our every click, our every hover, right? And so now at this point, it has enough information to characterize us. Things
Mhm.
like our
Yes.
address, our postal code. So
Yes.
why is this dangerous and why is this very critical in the moment? So
Yes.
imagine that you're applying for a job, and this has happened. I use examples that have happened with the
Yeah.
case of Amazon. Their hiring practice was able to use things like proxies to say this is a desirable applicant. This person isn't as desirable. So, for example, perhaps the school you went to, perhaps that you
Mhm.
were in scanning your resume part of the
Mhm.
women's soccer club, right? It could say by proxy that this is a woman who went to X university, who's perhaps of X religion, and therefore this person is not desirable within this context and this work culture. It could also be applied to things like banking, insurance, and so much more, where artificial intelligence is already making so many decisions in so many companies that it is through the characterization process to say that this person is either high risk or low risk or desirable, not desirable. This is what AI is currently doing. And it becomes absolutely critical and dangerous when we think about the line implications of how this might actually affect somebody's opportunity to persist, to flourish, just the economic outcomes, right? If I don't get the job because I'm a woman with a specific name who went to an all girls school, that is
Mhm.
critical, that is important. So
Mhm. Yes.
the significance is making sure that there is fairness in the characterization process, there's transparency in it, so that when AI has become the key decision maker in so many aspects of our life, that it is doing so fairly and characterizing us with equity.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. That's good. And I like that perspective of basically of that equity element and good example given there as well in terms of who's being selected in the in AI systems and how is an AI system kind of learning things and frankly in that particular example you give us it's learning from a biased perspective which is a little bit scary, right? Not a little bit scary, it is completely scary, but
Yes.
good example. So, Dr.
Yes.
Kim, on another note, in some of your writings, you've described the need for culturally attuned AI, which seems like a very good idea. Now, what does culturally responsible AI actually look like in practice, especially when systems are deployed across very different societies sometimes?
Wow, yes. Again, a very good question. I think it's a perfect question that should probably have been question two because I could have extended on question one. But when we think about, how AI is actually now so laden in every space that we exist. Now, I'll use the example of therapy, for example, because my sister is a therapist, so she knows, she tells me a lot of these stories, and I think about how do we actually, if we were to situate the tool that you're using, say in Cambodia or the Caribbean or in indigenous context, how might that work? And so the one example that I want to cite, in fact, I have two examples, but I'll start with the one example of
Hmm.
imagine that you're using some sort of an AI-powered tool that helps mediate, that interaction with, say, a patient. Now, imagine that some patients may come from cultural contexts where, for example,
Hmm.
their healing might be enabled by being in community with their elders and their family and so forth, right? So this is something that is whose values are foundationally relational. I identify myself because I identify my community, and it is in there that I create meaning for my life. But imagine a context where you have an AI powered tool that sees you as an individual, as an atomized individual, and it is
Yes.
providing, and you're talking to your therapist and you're providing feedback, or maybe you're not providing feedback, and it now clocks you as this person is high risk, right? But not understanding that you come from a specific cultural context that the AI powered tool has not been taught or machine learned to understand that your path for solutioning your wellness, right, comes from the fact that you come from a community where it is a community relational situation and not one of a checkbox that says, well, this person didn't respond the way I expected. So when we think about culturally attuned AI, we must consider that no technology is neutral, right? It brings in the
Hmm.
values of those who created it. And the example I was giving a little earlier, at least in our other conversation, had to do with the general space of chatbots as therapy, for example, or whether it is a therapist using a chatbot to some extent as a mediation in therapy. And so, in some cultures, perhaps healing is a process that is done as an atomized individual. And maybe in some cultures, it requires some degree of relationship with your community, whether it's your
Hmm.
elder. So imagine a
Hmm.
chatbot, and this has already happened. So all the examples I'm using has happened. Imagine a chatbot that is in conversation with maybe a teenager, where it's taking silence or a lack of response as something that should be labeled, well, this teenager is high risk, not realizing that perhaps this person is not the person that you think that person is. Perhaps that healing journey is done outside of that system, in
Ah,
community,
yes.
right? So this is
Yes.
just one
Yes.
example. And the other example I would like to give, which is something that is very central to some conversations I'm having as well, too. Let's just
Hmm.
resituate it in the context of banking. For
Hmm.
many countries in the global south, when we think about our finances, it is not something we do as atomized individuals. It is a
Hmm.
community thing, right? And so, AI powered systems, specifically in the banking system, does not consider me as a person as somebody belonging in a community with values around finances. It sees me as that
Yes.
one transactional being that it's interacting with. So when I talk about about culturally attuned AI, it is a deep conversation that we need to have, but it's about making sure that the people AI software is serving was actually built with their input, built with their contributions to understand their lived experiences and their context in terms of how it will service them as a piece of
Hmm.
technology, as a
Hmm.
tool.
Hmm.
So this is why I think the conversation is just again being in the lobby of a very big building, but it needs to be something that needs to happen as we think about whose values are we encoding in these systems and
Yes.
how does it see us? Mhm.
I love that analogy that you made about that we have to have these conversations in the lobbies of very big buildings, exactly, so that we're inclusive in it, and you know what, we have a lot of different voices kind of coming at this to make sure that we get this right because it's
Yes,
the consequences of not getting it right are quite dramatic, right? So that's the importance there. So
yes.
let me ask my last question here. When we spoke earlier, you had
Mhm.
mentioned that AI designers need something kind of like a technological Hippocratic oath, which I thought
Um,
that's brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. I love that idea. If we were to design AI systems with that principle in mind, what would responsible AI design actually need from our engineers and our scientists today? What do you think?
wow, yes. So for me, that question goes back to my own practice working at Siemens for so long on
Hmm.
medical software, specifically where when we were deciding to handle patient records as digital artifacts, it was very important for us to encode in that system some degree of the Hippocratic oath under what in the US is called HIPAA. It's a
Hmm.
long word, but the
Hmm.
acronym is called HIPAA. And that has actually gone out the way when we have companies like Amazon being the holder of so much of American, for example, in that context, people's medical records, right? And
Yes.
there is no one actually governing who gets to see my medical data, who gets to see what drugs I bought, and all of that.
Hmm.
So when I
Hmm.
talk about from a technologist perspective, I think the role of the technologist has changed. It is one that is not really taught in school that as you design things as a computer scientist or as a designer, there needs to be some built-in common sense as well as trained ethical guidance in terms of when you
Hmm.
encounter interfaces where people's data is being
Hmm.
transacted, there
Hmm.
needs to be
Hmm.
due diligence and guidance in terms of the level of protection given to people's data. So when I talk about us needing as technologists our own degree of a Hippocratic oath, that's what I mean. Now that data
Yes.
is the commodity that everybody transacts in, we need to have some governance and privacy guidelines around that.
Yes.
Is what I meant.
Yeah. 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 Basically, to protect that our patient, or and the patient here being society at large, or the users of the system and such. Yeah, that makes sense.
Absolutely. I have one example. One of the women that I
Hmm.
walked my dogs with a couple of summers ago, she's a nurse to AIDS patients. This is just a very concrete example where you see how
Yeah.
traumatic this may become, where you have companies that are saying to patients who may have physically, in real life, gone to the pharmacy to get their medication, where they're now being forced to transact this interaction in digital spaces. That's privacy, that's information that was once private. I am now sitting at a desk which belonged to my father-in-law, who was a surgeon. And this
Uh-huh.
particular desk has four key entries, because this is where he kept his patients' private information,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so when you take that analog perspective and you situate it in a digital space, this has just gone out the window. And so we need to bring back in this high degree of respect for people's data that are just now being transacted like they're Pokemon cards, right?
Hmm.
Online. And
Hmm.
so that is what I mean about as technologists, we really need to grow into new roles of understanding that we now have the responsibility of what, say, for example, a doctor would have had in practice in analog circumstance. And so that is what I mean by
Yes.
that. Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely does make sense. And that's a brilliant observation, and frankly, what, a gap, because we that is definitely a gap in today's, AI technology at the moment.
Yes. And
So,
I'm sure, Charles, you remember the first
yeah.
breach with the banks back in the day. I want to say it was around 2001 when there was a
Uh-huh. Yeah.
breach in Canadian banking. It was, oh my gosh, they have our banking information. Now it's everyday occurrence when there's a
Yes.
data
Yes.
breach, right? And we are now
Yes.
being normalized to accept that this is normal. It isn't normal to have everybody's laundry out there on,
Yes.
clotheslines, and
Yes.
everybody can see that. So we need to bring back some stability and some degree of respectability for people's private information.
Good analogies. Good analogies. Dr. Kim, thank you so much for joining me. I loved our conversation today, and this is, absolutely fascinating conversation about all the different responsibilities that come with building these intelligent systems. Your perspective on human agency and the culturally attuned design, and how technology just impacts our lives and people's lives, it gives us an important lens on what responsible AI technology and systems really need to become, because I don't think we're there yet. Dr. Kem-Laurin Lubin is a researcher, designer, and professor at the University of Waterloo. Her work explores the intersection of design, artificial intelligence, and computational rhetoric. This research challenges us to think more carefully about the values we embed in technologies we build and how they shape our lives. And this wraps up another episode of Responsible AI in Action. In each conversation, we speak with leaders across the technology, academia, and industries to explore what responsible AI really means in practice. Thank you again to our audience for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you yet again in the next episode of Responsible AI in Action.